just to say, it's not really new for me to engage with journalists. In my work in the region, we have been working with journalists, training journalists, working together to identify how to create change in our region. And for instance, I was hosted by the Nile Basin Initiative, the one at Entebbe, for more than 10 years. And during that period, I worked in all the member states, particularly Ethiopia, Eritrea, Sudan, South Sudan, and so on. And then later on, I was a member of the African Union's Technical Committee on Climate Change. And we were also, especially with my friend there, working under the auspices of AMCAO, which is the African Ministers' Council on Water, developing policies, developing guidelines, and creating greater coordination between African countries. And there are two things that I think are really crucial here. One is coordination, collaboration across African countries, a South-South collaboration. I'm very happy to see it's happening, and especially the fourth estate, which I think is the most critical, because you're our medium of communication to the rest or to the three other estates, if not necessarily the wider population. And then the second thing I think is really crucial is that we need journalists to understand what is climate change, what is really happening on the ground, why is it such a critical issue, why should we focus on it, what are the risks and the challenges to our countries, but at the same time, what are the opportunities we have to overcome these challenges. My presentation is going to focus on water, climate change, and drought. And this is deliberate because our biggest challenge in the greater Horn of Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa at the moment is drought. As many of you are aware, the current drought we have is the worst in how many years? It was 40 years last year, but it's continuing, it's persistent. I just came back from Isiolo and Marsabit, and in those areas, it is now one of the worst tragedies, economic, social, and devastates people's livelihoods. Completely wipes out their asset base, which is livestock for pastoralism. Restocking will take a much longer period. The second is water in the NDCs. What are the NDCs? Nationally determined contributions. This must be one of the very key, some of the very key words you must know. And it comes out of the Paris Agreement. It was agreed that to keep the global temperature from increasing beyond 2.5 and to keep it around 1.5, all the countries, they need to decide what they are going to do in their own right to make sure their emissions towards global warming, and also what they can do to capture carbon, which is in the atmosphere, through, for instance, tree planting, wetland restoration, and so on. That these efforts are or need to be captured in the NDC so that we can see at a global level what is each country contributing to reduction in global warming, even as they try to adapt. And I'm going to give some examples from the IGAD countries, because that is our zone, and it is much easier for us to understand what's happening at the wider level if we engage with the countries at this level. But at the same time, it is not a panacea. The fact that we create these policies, we create these plans, we even fund them, there are still very major challenges when it comes to implementation. So we're going to be looking at what are some of the challenges in implementation. After that, we're going to see what practical examples do we have of enhancing water security through implementing the nationally declared contributions. You get me? So you have the NDC, and then you look at what are the actions that were planned there, which ones have been implemented, what are they leading to? And finally, we're going to look at improving cross-sector impacts. Because we might say that, okay, we have improved water security, but what happens to hunger? What happens to health? Because again, under the climate regime, you're going to get a lot more new diseases. In fact, COVID-19 could be said to have been a wake-up call, because it is typical of the kind of new or old diseases that suddenly emerge across very wide sections of the population. For instance, in Kenya, they are expecting the malaria zones will increase by almost 20 to 30%. It will move to areas which have never experienced it before, the highland areas, because of temperature change. With increase in temperature, then even Nairobi becomes a bit more like Kisumu or Mombasa. So you find malaria moving to these zones. And there'll be other diseases, particularly the ones which are linked to animals. I don't know how many of you have heard of One Health. Who's heard of One Health? Yes, my friends from Uganda. What is One Health?
One Health, I think it is looking at health in a holistic way. They're looking at wildlife. You are looking at human beings, and then that one, and once you I think the environment.
Yes, that's correct. And who else wanted to contribute? Similar, yes. What happens is that as a result of human exploitation and degradation of environment, especially deforestation and land use changes, and there are so many diseases that used to be confined in those areas. And now, because of greater interaction with human beings, those diseases are becoming more common among human beings. And that's why the world has decided to go for a One Health approach and consider not only livestock, but wildlife and the diseases that they have. How can they cross over to human beings? In fact, they suggest that COVID is one of the most obvious examples of this. So, looking at water, climate change, and drought. Water plays a crucial role in climate change and drought in sub-Saharan Africa. In fact, I would say for sub-Saharan Africa, this issue of water has the greatest impact. And also across the globe, most of the impacts from climate change. What causes the impact on climate change? It's energy. It's in the energy cycle. The carbon, the greenhouse gases, and so on. That is what drives global warming. But almost all the impacts are through the water cycle. The floods, the droughts, the changes in precipitation, and their impact on food security, the impacts on health, and so on. Almost all of them can be found, or the impact can be traced to the water cycle. So climate change affects the water cycle by altering precipitation patterns and increasing evaporation, leading to more frequent and intense droughts. And second, the drought in turn exacerbates the effects of climate change by reducing water availability for agriculture, increasing water scarcity, and leading to food insecurity. So you have to look at the two as you can call them sisters. Drought is not exactly climate change. Climate change causes increased temperature. The increased temperature has different impacts, among which is drought. And the drought can come in two ways. Because there is a change in the precipitation pattern, droughts are longer. But at the same time, in certain parts of Africa, we will have more intense rainfall. I don't know how many of you have heard that Rift Valley lakes, the levels are really rising. But this does not benefit the local population because even as the level on the lake rises, you're having increased evaporation. So the water is available for much shorter periods and the crops cannot get enough for their sustenance. That's why we're having a very, food insecurity has increased drastically because vegetation cover is reducing as a result of the change, particularly due to evaporation. And then at the same time, there are human-driven factors which aggravate both drought and also climate change impacts. Over-extraction of water from underground aquifers and rivers for drinking and irrigation contributes to water security, exacerbating impact of drought. For instance, and this one is purely human-driven. How many of you are from Kenya? Yes, what has happened to the water table in Karen Langata region? Who knows what has happened over the last 50 years? For environmental journalists, I think you're very quiet. So, okay, I think we'll have to have somebody giving us an energy. But essentially, this is what has happened. Because of increased population, because of an increased number of boreholes in these places, the water table has decreased. It used to be 60 meters, 50 to 60 meters. That's where you found groundwater. Now it has gone as deep as 300 meters. And that means a lot of the wells, a lot of the boreholes, which were constructed long time ago, even in the 70s and 80s and even early 90s, they can no longer be used because the water has sunk very much deeper. You need to redevelop. And this is because of lack of control. And that's why the Water Resources Authority needs to up its game and really do critical analysis of the groundwater tables in order to ensure that we do not overexploit the groundwater resources. There is a second and third impact from this that has not yet been well understood. And this is that we have like 3 aquifers. Aquifers are where you find the water within the ground. We have 3 aquifers. The top one is the sweet water, and that is the one is most commonly used, sweet water in Nairobi. The second one is slightly salty. It is still usable, but it is slightly salty. It's mixed up with several things. You know, we live in the Rift Valley, and the Rift Valley, for historic reasons, has what do you call it? Volcanic material, some of which is quite poisonous, but some of which we live with. You can think of the you know, like iron. You can think of sulfur. What is the most popular one? The one that you know, create a problem with bone. Fluoride. Fluoride, yes. And then we also have calcium. We have different minerals. Now, the sweet layer does not have those minerals, but the second layer does. But we are in danger because the third layer is really poisonous. And the problem is that it will not stick to its third position. What happens is that if we keep pricking, you know, with the boreholes all over the place, what happens is that that water, which is quite, you might say poisoned, will start seeping into the other 2 layers. And then you will have a disaster in Nairobi because suddenly you will not have usable groundwater. So human impact is very negative. Another possible one, I don't know how many of you have been along the, you know, to Athi River, Kajiado, and quite a number of these places, where people who use what's happening out there.
I'm sorry about this.
Okay, people who are using stream water for irrigation, river and stream. What happened previously? They used to have these diesel-generated pumps. I mean, pumps running on diesel. And what's happening now is that many of them are changing from diesel to solar. Exactly. And what happens? Petrol, diesel are expensive. So they only used to run it for half an hour, just what is needed, especially in the evenings, because then the water percolates better. Now, with the solar, they leave it there the whole day. So what's going to happen? Again, over extraction, because now there is no longer any control. So this is something that we need to think about going forward. And then, as we mentioned, climate change and drought increase the frequency and severity of waterborne diseases, affecting the health and well-being of population. I don't know how many of you have noticed that in the last 5 years, there has been an enormous increase in livestock, I mean, diseases that affect livestock. East Coast fever, Rift Valley fever, and foot and mouth, and quite a number of the diseases which were confined and would only break out maybe once every 3-4 years. Now it's almost every year they're coming out, and they are in a much wider spread area, because the temperature is favorable to these diseases, even in areas which never used to have these kind of infections before. So managing water wisely and reducing the impacts of climate change is critical to mitigate the impacts of drought in sub-Saharan Africa. For the first time in history, you found, well, maybe not in history, but certainly very dramatic. The top picture comes from northeastern Kenya, where more than 6 giraffes died in one particular place they'd gone for water. The lower one is more common because this happens every time we have a critical drought, like in 2011 and so on, devastation of livestock. But it's now starting to affect wildlife, which used to move from place to place because there is no longer adequate vegetation and water to support them. I don't know how many of you have ever seen a dead zebra. This was almost something unbelievable in history. A dead zebra, dying of starvation. Yeah, this is something that we had. So there are many things, there are many impacts which are coming around, and they are driven by both climate change and drought. And water is the only solution to this. And that's why water in the NDC, the nationally determined contribution, is a key component of the Paris Agreement. And in the context of climate change, in the sub-Saharan, the NDC, so I don't know how many, okay, but Africa 21 and the water diplomat, what is the possibility that we can provide more details, maybe information and support?
We can easily provide a lot more information I can get it from Simon.
Okay.
Then we can share, but maybe you want to be more specific than this, then we can be more focused in the response. But I think you're referring to the 3 water layers, referring to the impacts of solar. Is that the 2 things I got?
Yeah.
What else? There might be other requests. Then we know what to collect.
Yeah. And the climate information, the outlook over the next 5 years, when you couple that to population growth, industrialization, environmental degradation, then we want to see how can our societies become more resilient to these multiple impacts.
Then if we know what you need, Simon and I can put together something and send it to everybody.
Yes, and there's the lady. Yes, when I was involved in the preparation of Kenya's NDC, the last one that Uhuru took to Glasgow, we did have quite some conversation, particularly with the Directorate for Public Health, and there is also a special division at UNEP, at the United Nations Environment Program, that is addressing the issue between climate change and human health. And this has, in some ways now, perhaps been a little bit overtaken by events because there is the One Health initiative involving also ILRI, ILRI, International Life. So we can be able to get some of the specific information and look at data sets and be able to customize this for public information, and this is also something we can share with you. Is there how do you call it, a rapporteur? Maybe they can just put together some of these notes and then we can see how we can follow up on this. Yes, but the what do you call it? As we mentioned, there's malaria, there's the yellow fever, there is whatnot. Even some of these other diseases that you're finding now, like Ebola, the greater white, what do you call it? They come from that interface between wildlife and human beings. And you don't know whether the encroachment by human beings is just driven by population pressure or because they've destroyed the land they are living on, or because climate change has changed the environment. So they're moving to what they think are greener pastures, but creating a lot of adverse or negative impact subsequently. Yes, so if I can continue. These NDCs from countries in the Greater Horn, many of them include specific measures to improve water management and to reduce impacts of climate change on water resources. For instance, Ethiopia's NDC includes a focus on increasing water storage capacity through the construction of dams and the increasing efficiency of irrigation systems to reduce water loss. If I remember right, one of the best examples we have from this region is Ethiopia's investment in watershed management, which included capturing runoff through these small dams, but also subsurface, and also looking at how they could reduce degradation of land and at the same time increase vegetation cover in quite a number of areas. That intervention was responsible for greatly reducing the impact of drought, especially on livestock in that region. Unfortunately, they only did it on their side of the border. And as you know, the population in this country is highly mobile. So as soon as they know there's grass on the Ethiopian side and water, then, so Yes, so they cross over. Similarly, a lot of the progress you might achieve in some places in Kenya, like in Laikipia, for instance, will immediately attract people from the neighboring counties, not even countries, counties like Samburu and Isiolo and so on. They will naturally move in. It's can call it invasion, but for them, they're pastoralists and they're looking for grass. So we have to understand that these interventions, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, cannot be confined to the local area. We must think of the greater region. And then, yes, increasing efficiency of irrigation systems to reduce water loss. And some of the NDCs also increase measures to improve or increase the resilience of communities to the impact of climate change and drought, such as improving access to clean water, drinking water, and water-saving technologies. For instance, Kenya's NDC has a target to reach the SDGs, and this is one of the good opportunities you have to accelerate achievement of the SDGs. You look at how can we be able to implement some of these activities through the NDC, because the NDC has a possibility of international financing, whereas the SDGs are more or less left to national means. Are we familiar with the SDGs? Who is not familiar with the SDG? SDG 6 particularly. We have a great champion of SDG 6.
Yeah, I presented yesterday.
Oh, you presented, okay. Fine.
And I think the point you're making is very, very crucial, this issue of funding.
Yes.
Yeah. Did you hear what we said just now on funding? Can you repeat?
SDG is more or less left to national means, but the NDCs, they have a locally, what can you do locally? But a lot of it is dependent on international financial flows because it's a global problem you're solving. And therefore, you find like GCF, the Global Climate Fund, you find the Adaptation Fund, you find LDC funds and so on, which are all geared to reducing the impacts of climate change or dealing with mitigation. And this can be used to help achieve the SDGs. And that's why in some of the countries like Kenya, they have linked the NDC with the SDGs. Other NDCs aim to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the water sector by promoting use of renewable energy in water treatment and distribution. It so happens that for a long time, for more than the 25 years our chairman was mentioning, our biggest challenge in the water sector has been the cost of energy, particularly electricity. You find that in quite a number of the utilities, it is more than half the operational cost. That means the cost of electricity is bigger than the cost of water treatment chemicals, all the salaries that have to be paid, all the pipes that have to be laid and their repayment and so on. Just one factor, energy. And that's why when we are thinking about impacts of climate change, we are also thinking about energy. And that's why Kenya is also in some ways very lucky because they've been able to shift their energy mix from just thermal, which causes thermal energy is the one from fossil fuels, Kipevu and so on, towards where first it was hydropower, but then again, because of the challenges with rainfall and the levels of the dams going down, it's geothermal. So geothermal has really increased, and others like importing electricity from Ethiopia and also generating our own wind power capacities. So they are looking at that thermal mix, but it's quite important for the water sector. But at the same time, water sector also has significant greenhouse gas emissions because our dams normally are placed in locations which create negative impact on vegetation, which rots and which releases methane and other greenhouse gases. Plus, when we use diesel and petrol-driven pumps to move water to areas where we want, we also cause greenhouse gas warming. The NDCs provide a framework for the and then we have an example of Sudan where the NDC includes a target to increase use of renewable energy in the water sector and also to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the water sector by a factor, by 20%. This is enormous because most people talk about 3, 5%, 2%. Sudan has a target of 20%. The NDCs also provide a framework for the countries in sub-Saharan Africa to incorporate water management and sustainable water use into their climate action plans. I think this is what we've been saying. And the implementation of these NDCs can help to reduce the impacts of climate change and drought on water resources, and also improve the resilience of communities to these impacts, especially solar. As we say, it's like fire. It's very useful. It can also be very dangerous. One of the most useful aspects is that it is distributed. You don't have to wait for a big dam to put solar in most of the locations. So it can be used in a lot of areas, and it can have very beneficial effects. Like one of the biggest challenges you might say in the water sector has been in ASAL areas, but also some of the other areas which don't have enough streams and rivers. They tend to use a lot of boreholes, groundwater pumping, but then the pumping is very slow. You might find that it has enough water, but women and children are spending a lot of time queuing. I remember one time some place in Baringo where people were queuing up to 6 hours. They used to come by 4 a.m. in the morning so that they can line up to get the little water. And you've seen this in Nigeria and a lot of other places. Now, solar is helping to alleviate that because you can have an elevated tank and everyone can get water much faster. But at the same time, that comes with a problem because it's extracting much faster. So there'll be a lot more wastage and a lot more water will be extracted from that particular borehole. And you do not know the safe use because it has not really been tested. So it comes, as we say, that like a fight, positive, but can have negative impacts. So despite planning very carefully, investing a lot of resources in these NDCs, there are significant challenges when it comes to implementation. One is lack of funding. Implementing the water-related provisions in NDCs require significant investment, but many countries in Africa lack the financial resources to fund these initiatives, and this limits the ability of these countries to implement their NDCs effectively. For those of you, who are familiar with the region, in every country in sub-Saharan Africa, apart possibly from Egypt, and even there, I think they might have, there are plans for mega dams, many very large dams. South Sudan has them. Kenya has Thuo, Grand High Falls. Is it Grand High Falls? 450 billion. Uganda has quite a few already. I think some of them have already been implemented. Just think of the number of dams that are planned, and you can already start to see. The challenge is we don't have enough finances, we don't have enough technical capacity, but one of the biggest challenges, of course, is on the cash flow that is required to develop this infrastructure, even when it's in the NDC. Even when they are small and they are in a lot of different locations, there are still significant challenges because of the lack of funding. The second is limited technical capacity. Many countries in the region lack technical capacity to implement water-related provisions in their NDCs, particularly in areas such as water management and water-saving technologies. And this can limit the effectiveness of NDC implementation and result in a failure to achieve intended outcome. You can say that one of the biggest wastes we have in the water sector is one of our measures of progress, and that is in sewerage, because our conventional sewerage removes from the water cycle that we can reuse enormous quantities of water. For instance, Nairobi loses more than 200 to 300,000 cubic meters per day of water that goes into the sewerage and then is just released without any capacity to reuse. We also waste a lot of water that comes from our roads, storm water, and this destroys the road carriageway. And there are some very good techniques to capture, to harvest, and to safely use this water. So we don't have to think of rocket science. There are available techniques that with little training, communities can be able to utilize. But to ensure that we have enough training and enough, it starts with sensitization. If we could work with all the county governments for instance, in Kenya, we invite them and we discuss with the engineers and also the LCAs about the impact that just capturing runoff, the rain that falls on the road, if we can capture this and use it for agriculture, for livestock, it can have enormous beneficial impact, not only for the livestock and also for the food security, but also for the roads themselves. But we do not have enough. I don't know what is really missing, but I think the sensitization is one of the biggest challenges. And therefore, I think the role of the media in this kind of aspect is going to be really crucial. And then fragility. Most of our countries are quite fragile across the sub-Saharan Africa. And there's a lot of political instability and conflict, which can reduce the ability of the countries to implement their NDCs. And water-related initiatives may be delayed or disrupted due to this kind of instability. And then there is also lack of coordination. There's lack of coordination between different sectors and stakeholders involved in NDC implementation, which can result in lack of integrated approach to water management. Cases in point, you find livestock sector, they want to develop an abattoir, but they forget that they need water, they need a road in order to, for the farmers to deliver, and also for, for the market, for access to market. And then they forget they also need electricity, because there is need for mechanization, there is need for, cold chilling of the products they have. So you find that at the end of the construction of the abattoir, it cannot be functional because essential components or other infrastructure that is necessary to develop this or to utilize the facilities that are created had not been thought of. It's normally an addition, and somebody always assumes someone else would be looking at this. And then you find the people in the water sector do not want to share budget and planning with the people in the agriculture sector or livestock. Then there is a lot of disaster. Similarly, irrigation projects are implemented without a thought to downstream users or without a thought to how much water they'll be taking, extracting overall. And then you find some rivers are drying up and then users downstream are up enough. This has been happening, especially when the pastoralists think that the commercial agriculture users upstream are diverting all the water that should be coming to them. So you find that there is a significant conflict. And then also implementing water-related provisions in the NDCs is challenging and requires investment, that is finance, technical capacity and stability. And addressing these limitations is critical. So we have some examples of enhanced water security through the NDC implementation, like Senegal and Kenya. The NDC include a focus on improving water management and reducing impact of climate change on water resources through new dams, development of small-scale irrigation systems, and promotion of water-saving technologies. These have been implemented and they've had a significant effect, improving access to water availability for agriculture and resilience of communities to impacts of climate change. But again, they're, it's not adequate, because even 15% improvement is very, very significant. But if 60–70% of the population is faced with that challenge, then you still have another 55% who are still left vulnerable. Rwanda's NDC.
I have 5 minutes only.
Oh, okay.
Actually, I'm done with the time.
Okay, thanks. Rwanda's NDC includes improved access to safe drinking water. And Rwanda is one of the very few very successful examples. Over 90% of the population now has access to improved water sources. But I think for journalists, what could be of interest to you is that despite COVID, Rwanda significantly improved access to sanitation, and not in the urban areas, in the rural areas, which is #1 challenge for Africa's SDGs. And then South Africa's NDC includes reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the water sector through use of solar powered water pumps and development of small hydropower projects. And this has increased the use of clean, renewable energy. It's difficult to believe this because the overwhelming impact, the stories we get from South Africa are mostly about the lack of electricity. So even the small gains here cannot, they are lost. So Uganda, Ethiopia, and Malawi's NDCs seek to improve water management and reduce water stress. So they've also had significant implementation success in increasing water availability and improving water for communities. So I think generally these stories demonstrate the potential for NDCs to improve water management and reduce impacts of climate change, but they highlight the need for sustained efforts and investment to ensure implementation is successful and that it results in meaningful impacts. Because you can have successful implementation, but it has very little impact. I think quite a number of our countries have faced this challenge. You get a lot of funding maybe from the World Bank and it's meant to achieve a certain impact. At the end of the day, you can hardly see, what the impact has been because they have never really thought through the process and to ensure that there is systemic development. So the last one is an update on the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation, which is an organization I work with, and it is looking at different countries' preparedness in terms of climate change and water resources management. So, for instance, I'm involved in supporting Egypt in addressing how is water supporting and supported by Egypt's NDC. And so we don't only look at the NDC, we look at other cross-sector issues. We look at the National Climate Change Strategy, the nationally determined contribution, and other key planning documents in the Egyptian sector. And then we subject this to an analysis. How well does it address the issue of water? Second, how well does it address the issue of coordination? And how does it address the issue of financing? Is the financing proposed there sustainable? So, Chairman, I'll just rush. And we do this very rigorously. Let me just go back a little bit. If you see at the bottom, we look at 4 sectors: water in national climate plans, like what I've mentioned there. Then water in national planning and governance across the 5-year or 10-year or 30-year economic development plans. How is water addressed? And then water and climate connections in specific sectors, like you're mentioning, water and health, water and food security, water and energy, water and urban development. We look at those specific sectors. Are they sufficiently informed? And then we look at the links to financing and clear implementation of the project in an integrated way. So this, for instance, it just looks at water in the national climate plans, one of the 4 areas, and we have more than 30 questions. These are simple questions, but they force the managers to really interrogate their documents and find what areas have they not addressed, like linkages with other sectors, the capacity, the resource envelope for financing, their integrated or coordinated use with other sectors. And at the end, it helps them to develop more integrated, more comprehensive NDCs, because we found a lot of them were very significantly lacking in that cross-sectoral coordination and planning for the resources that could be available. So I'll stop there. I had a lot more, but we've run out of time.